I'm so pleased to be moderating this panel on such a really important, critically important topic, one that sadly is so emblematic of the institutional racism we see in policing today. And in today's topic, addressing school police and school discipline, where there is an unfortunate tendency to criminalize or harshly discipline students of color and students with disabilities, even including our youngest, most vulnerable children. It's difficult to talk about school police without talking about school discipline. These issues are woven together. The school to prison pipeline occurs when school systems turn over school discipline to law enforcement, who are often stationed in schools as school resource officers. Our panelists today have an incredible expertise and experience to share with us, which will help shed light on this complex topic. We're looking forward to your questions, which you can submit using the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard, and we'll get to as many as we can. Hadassah Barrelly, a third-year law student and president of the Society for Equity in Education, will be helping us today with the questions. Tomorrow night, you're also invited to join us for another webinar we're offering in concert with a student group, UB Students for Public Interest, often known as UB SPY. Three UB Law alumni will share what public interest lawyering looks like in the time of COVID and beyond. After a little break, this series will be back in mid-July with a look at the use of forensic evidence in criminal cases, and you can learn more and register on the UB Law website. And now for this afternoon's discussions. I'd like to introduce our panel. Cara McClellan is an assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where she works primarily on increasing equitable access to education and ending the criminalization of Black people. She's represented children, families, and communities in lawsuits challenging discriminatory school discipline policies and military-style policing tactics. Ms. McClellan is a co-author of the 2018 report, Our Girls, Our Future, Investing in Opportunity and Reducing Reliance on the Criminal Justice System in Baltimore, and we'll be sure to put a link to that report in the chat. Welcome, Ms. McClellan. Monisha Cherayil is a staff attorney in the Public Justice Center's Education Stability Project. She helped launch the Maryland Suspension Representation Project, a statewide effort to provide free legal representation to students facing disciplinary removals in schools. Michele Hall is a public defender at the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. She currently works in the appellate division and on legislative advocacy on issues related to the juvenile legal system. She began her trial work as a juvenile defender in OPD's Prince George's County office. And Professor Odeana Neal has been at the UB Law, a UB Law faculty member since 1989. She teaches juvenile justice law and human rights law, among other topics. Welcome, panelists. Throughout our discussion, we will try and post some links and articles in the chat that will help you get a deeper understanding of this issue. For those interested, we will also be sending a document with additional resources to attendees after the webinar. So thank you, panelists, for joining us this afternoon, and to our audience, thank you for joining as well. I also want to thank Chris Stutz, our Director of Communications, for her assistance with today's presentation. So now we're going to get this started with our discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. McClellan, who's going to give us an overview of what is the school to prison pipeline, how did it start, and what has led to its growth? Ms. McClellan?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be with such a distinguished panel. And even though virtually in a city that is so close to my heart and to LDF's heart and work. Just as background, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall, who of course is a Baltimore native. We work in the areas of political participation, criminal justice, education, and economic justice. We argued Brown v. Board, and we continue to do school desegregation and related work today. And we see the work around the school to prison pipeline and removing police from schools as directly related to the legacy of Brown. One of the reasons for this is that when school push-outs first kind of surfaced as a term that people were using in advocacy, believe it or not, it was as early as the 1950s that people began using this term.
Ms. McClellan, I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second. Do you want us to start your slides now?
Oh, sure, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
That was a great point. Thank you. So I wanted to start just by kind of giving that history on the next slide of LDF and our work around desegregation because I think it's really important to ground this conversation in that history. It was after states and local districts were required to comply with desegregation orders that this uptick in discipline happened. And if you look at back at some of the Hugh reports, even I was recently looking at one of the Hugh reports in the 70s in Prince George's County, people were using the term pushout and talking about discriminatory discipline of Black students. And really what they were concerned about was an attempt to evade the requirements of Brown v. Board to desegregate schools by literally excluding Black students through discriminatory discipline, by using suspensions and expulsions to push Black students out of schools. And so that's where that term comes from. And I just wanted to start us with that grounding because there's no doubt that this is a racial justice history that comes out of a complicated history of trying to maintain white supremacy and inequality in our country and trying to limit the access of Black students to school and to education, but also because it just reminds us on a really practical level of why it is that we are so concerned about exclusionary discipline through suspensions and expulsions. And that has to do with the fact that it's keeping students out of the classroom. And when you're keeping students out of a classroom, you're keeping students out of learning. So what is the school to prison pipeline? I wanted to start with this quote by our director, Counsel, also a Baltimore native, of course. And she talks about how really the school to prison pipeline is about resource decisions, that it's impossible to talk about the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, without talking about education, because we're really talking about decisions about what to fund and what not to fund and how that impacts students. So if we could go to the next slide, in our work, we describe the phenomenon of school pushout, of students being excluded through discipline as really multiple factors, the confluence of multiple factors coming together, right? So one is limited investment in educational opportunity for students of color. We know that districts and schools that serve primarily students of color are underfunded, that students of color have less access to challenging curriculum, to AP and to mentally gifted classes, even when they are more than qualified to take them, that they are less likely to be offered at schools that serve students of color. And so I wanted to name that because, of course, one of the factors that's leading to push out is students not being challenged and not being engaged in school. Second is over-reliance on exclusionary discipline, labeling what is misbehavior that all students engage in, or just sometimes just boredom, or again, this lack of engagement, as rather than student misbehavior that is pretty typical criminal behavior, trumping up the labels as if it is something more serious than what can be dealt with in the classroom. And for the vast majority of exclusionary discipline that we're seeing, it is, typical student misbehavior that can be dealt with in the classroom, as we'll talk about more. Third is the over-reliance on school police. So this idea that what would have once been dealt with a teacher or an administrator, having a conversation, having a detention, having conflict resolution or other solutions, is being dealt with as if it is criminal and involving school police or school resource officers, as we'll be talking about later. And again, this is a confluence of factors because it's less investment in classes and challenging curriculum, less investment in other services, together with an over-reliance on school police and exclusionary discipline. And then ultimately, as I know Michele is going to talk about later on, an over-reliance on confinement, because when you're involving police in schools, you're more likely to have referral to law enforcement, you're more likely to have arrests, and ultimately involvement of the juvenile justice system for, again, things that otherwise would have been dealt with in the school and in the classroom setting. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I want to emphasize, I started to call this slide Common Myths, and then I thought, no, let's call it what it is, which is really racial bias, and we need to name it that. There is no evidence that students of color misbehave more than their white peers. All of the data suggests the opposite, that all students engage in similar levels of misbehavior, regardless of racial background. And yet we see that students of color are disproportionately disciplined, especially when it comes to minor subjective offenses. And what I'm referring to is offenses like defiance, disturbance, disrupting the classroom, those types of discretionary decisions where adults can decide, well, maybe I'll deal with this through a phone call, maybe I'll deal with this through a suspension, and where there's that level of discretion to decide what to label it and how to respond based on that label. That is where we're seeing the bulk of the disparities in terms of how Black and Brown students are disciplined. School staff are more likely to negatively interpret the behavior of Black and Brown students, especially based on their own conscious or unconscious bias. Because again, there's no difference in terms of the rates of this behavior. Rather, there's a difference in terms of the perception, what the response is, and the tendency to think that police need to be involved when it's students of color or schools that serve students of color. And a study in Texas actually found that 97% of school suspensions were discretionary, and Black students were 31% more likely to receive them. And it's important to remember, as came up in the introduction, this starts early. Students of color made up a disproportionate percentage of preschoolers suspended. Believe it or not, there were 8,000 preschoolers suspended in 2012, one study found. And often this was for behaviors like hitting, biting, pinching. And so I wanted to just highlight a few examples that have been in the news that people may be familiar with, because I want to connect it to these systemic patterns that the data are showing us. So LDF represents 4 Black and Latina middle school girls in Binghamton, New York, who were subjected to discriminatory and illegal strip searches. They were walking through the hall, they were giggling, they were stopped by the principal and assistant principal, who found it suspicious that they were laughing and giddy, as the principal put it in his words. And they were then taken to the nurse's office and actually subjected to a strip search. So what we're talking about is, again, the criminalization of Black and Brown children, the tendency to view normal childhood behavior as suspicious or as inherently threatening or dangerous or worse, criminal, when anyone who has a middle school child knows that they often laugh, especially after lunch, especially in the hallway. Another example people may have been familiar with, in 2018, a Black 8-year-old student was arrested, handcuffed, taken to jail, and charged with felony battery for allegedly hitting a teacher. And in 2016, an SRO at a high school in South Carolina violently flipped the Black student in her desk to the floor. Folks may have seen that video, but again, it goes back to, was this police officer needed at school to begin with? And if so, was he even needed in this classroom to deal with the fact that the girl had a cell phone? That's something that school staff could deal with. But the fact that police are in school leads to a tendency to rely on them for dealing with childhood behavior in schools that wouldn't otherwise involve a police officer, and exposes our students to the dangers that come with police. And so, just to kind of wrap up, if we could go to the next slide, we have not always had police in school, right? This is a change that happened. The first police in schools were actually in 1953 in Flint, Michigan. And that's a city that many people are familiar with now. And it's important to talk about that history, because it's a district that has consistently, served Black and Brown students. And that's where police first started being used in schools. It expanded throughout the 1960s and 70s in other districts. And it can be directly traced to federal initiatives like the Gun-Free Schools Act in 1994, was provided over $750 million in funding for 6,500 new police officers in schools. just between 1999 and 2005. So we've seen an increase over recent decades, particularly following the 1999 shooting at Columbine High School in Colorado. According to the latest data, we know that there was about a increase of school safety officers. So this is not SRO, this is school security, of about 20%. So that went from 41% to 61.4%. And it was significantly higher in schools that serve students of color at rates of 76 to 100%. So those are schools that are predominantly students of color bearing the brunt of the increase in school police. And ultimately, we know that, given everything else going on in our country around how police are interacting with Black people, that this overly harsh response to behaviors when it comes to interactions with Black citizens, and that a tendency to use excessive force to view Black citizens as more criminal and as more threatening is not limited to adults, right? It doesn't stop just because the police officer is in a school. It is absolutely carrying the same level of dangerousness and concern when officers are placed in school districts as exists, for Black people generally out in the world interacting with police. So I would just end on this last slide with highlighting some of the advocacy that's going on nationally that's really being led by students. One of the hashtags that they've organized around is counselors, not cops. People may have also seen police-free schools is another hashtag that has, especially over the last year, really been lifted up a lot. It goes to this idea that we have to connect the movement that's going on around removing police and our interactions in society that don't need police more generally to removing police from schools, and thinking, really carefully about what is it that students do need and making our budgetary and resource decisions based on that. And so this graphic is just to show, where we're at right now. National data shows SROs are more likely to be stationed in predominantly Black and brown schools, even while these schools lack counselors. So 1.7 million students are in schools with cops, but no counselors. So that just goes back, I think, to the quote from the beginning about how are we investing and what message is that sending students if they don't have access to counselors, if they don't have access to academic opportunities, but they do have police officers. What message are we sending them? And it can't be a surprise at that point that there is a push out factor happening, or that there's a school to prison pipeline that we're going to be talking more about today happening systematically. So I will stop it there and pass it off to my colleagues. But that's an overview of how LDF has engaged in this as a racial justice issue.
Well, thank you so much. That really does give a very good kind of national perspective of this issue. And we know that there are many communities around the country that are dealing and grappling with this issue. Ms. Cherayil, I'm going to pass it to you to talk a little bit about what's happening here in Maryland. There's been a concerted effort over the past less than 10 years, but to reduce the exclusionary practices from discipline. And Maryland has made strides in that regard. But even though suspension rates have gone down, the disproportionality in suspension has remained steady. Can you tell us what's happening in Maryland in terms of, from the discipline perspective, but also from the school-based arrest perspective? We heard from Ms. McClellan in terms of Black students. What's happening here in Maryland for our students of color, as well as our students with disabilities? I know that's a lot.
Sure. And thank you so much for inviting me to come speak with you and to be in this conversation with my colleagues. It's really an honor and a pleasure. And Jason, you can go ahead and pull up the slides. As Cara laid out so persuasively, the national data is very clear that the school to prison pipeline, including the overuse of suspension, expulsion, school-based arrest, disproportionately targets and harms Black children, as well as children with disabilities. And we see that at the state level as well. So in this first slide, you see we're looking at suspensions. And what we see is that Black students make up about a third of the student population here in Maryland, but they receive 60% of our suspensions across the state. And we see that disparity in every single one of our districts, whether you're talking about a majority white district, a majority Black district. The composition does not, in any case, diminish the reality of race-based disproportionality in suspension. Next slide. Students with IEPs also, and these are students with special education plans, right? So they have a disability that means that they need certain additional services in school in order to be able to fully access the education. So students with IEPs make up about 12% of the student population here in Maryland, but receive about 25% of suspensions in school. Next slide. The same pattern plays out with school-based arrests. Black students, again, who make up a third of our student population, get 56% of our school-based arrest. And next slide, students with IEPs receive about 23% of school-based arrest, far more than their share of the overall population. Now, why do we see these types of disproportionality? With respect to race, I think Cara framed it really well. It's not about differences in actual behavior. It's about differences in how staff perceive and respond to the very same behavior when engaged in by students of different races. And it's about resources. The fact that majority Black schools are more likely than majority white schools to have police on site, to have more police and security than mental health providers, right? And as a practical matter, what that means is when there's a behavior issue, when there's a fight, if you're a white kid in a majority white school, you're more likely to get a counselor, an intervention, an opportunity to calm down and de-escalate. And if you are a student that attends a majority Black school, you are more likely to face an arrest. With respect to students with disabilities, the problem is that it's often the student's disability, whether we're talking about ADHD or an intellectual disability or autism, that may give rise to challenging behaviors, and schools may not be providing adequate special education services to address those behaviors in a non-exclusionary, non-punitive, supportive way. And WBAL actually recently ran a story about one of my colleagues' clients last year that I think illustrates this phenomenon really powerfully and really troublingly. So he was an 11-year-old with autism. He'd had an argument, a verbal spat with a friend. So had been pulled out of the situation, was in a cool down room, but began engaging in a behavior associated with his disability. He began sort of banging himself against the wall a bit. So now he wasn't hurting anyone else in any way, but because the school was not equipped to respond adequately, after a minute or two, they defaulted to calling in their on-site school police officer. And oftentimes the reality is that's the easiest thing to do if you don't have other tools and if you have an officer just down the hall. So the officer comes in, ends up handcuffing the child for over 20 minutes. And at the end of the day, he's incredibly traumatized, fearful of school, fearful of walking by an officer on the street, and he actually breaks his wrist. And this is all because he was engaged in behavior related to his disability that should have been addressed through his disability and special education plans. Next slide. Oh, here we are. I'll just close out this portion of the discussion to say that when we talk about suspension and expulsion and school-based arrest, and its heavy toll on Black students and students with disabilities, I want to be really clear that the behaviors that are prompting these aggressive responses that are literally pulling kids out of school into handcuffs, into the juvenile system, are not, for the most part, particularly extreme or egregious. Kids are getting suspended and expelled and arrested in school for run-of-the-mill behaviors that they engage in specifically because they're kids, because their brains are still developing, because they're still figuring out how to interact socially, how to resolve conflict in a constructive way. So you can see on this slide here that around 46% of school-based arrests in Maryland in 2018-19 or for fighting without weapons, right? The run-of-the-mill playground, schoolyard fight. Another 9% were for disruption and disrespect, those types of subjectively determined offenses that are very much susceptible to the influence of implicit bias. And really, in many cases, as I've seen with my own clients, are involve a situation where a kid is talking back or engaging in horseplay. Right. And then we've got sort of property offenses that includes minor theft. It includes trespass. I've had clients arrested for going into the school after hours to call for a ride home. And then, it goes on. But the basic point here is the 3,141 arrests that occurred in school last year, for the most part, they were not about guns in school or someone, coming to, cause a mass casualty event, which is often the reason that people justify the continued presence of police in schools. They really were just about kids being kids and making the mistakes that all kids make.
Thank you so much. I want to turn now to the impact on students when they are arrested or referred to the juvenile justice system. I'm going to be turning to Ms. Hall and Professor Neal to talk about the impact on students and their families and what that process looks like. I wonder first if Professor Neal, you can just talk about the disruption that it causes both for the child and for the family. And then Ms. Hall will talk with you about the kind of path into the system and what it means for a child to be in that system and access to services. Professor Neal?
Thank you. Well, fortunately, we have a lot of information about the impact of school disciplinary policies and arrests on children, and the results are not good. Kids who are suspended or expelled from school tend to come to have an aversion to school. And if they have an aversion to school, they're more likely to drop out of school. And if they're more likely to drop out of school, they are then more likely to engage in delinquent and perhaps then criminal behavior. So that when I don't know that it's clear, when we're talking about a pipeline, we really are talking about setting kids up for failure even while they're in school, and perhaps as young as being in elementary school. There are studies that show that once a child has been suspended or expelled from school, and as we've heard, for often relatively minor things like disrespect, whatever that means, or hearing once about a 5-year-old that was suspended from school for sexual harassment. You've got to ask about the effect that those kinds of disciplinary measures have on a child's relationship with school. And similarly, the mere presence of an SRO in a school can also affect the way that a child interacts with that school. In other words, is school a place for me to be safe and be protected and to learn? Or is school a place where I am seen as an enemy? And so the idea of there being disciplinary action that can then lead to a child suspension or expulsion, by the way, I'm not sure exactly what good activities they're supposed to be involved in if they're suspended or expelled, but then getting suspended or expelled, sometimes then being left on their own. Teenagers being teenagers will try out all kinds of risky behaviors because that's what teenagers do. And that can then lead to an introduction into the juvenile justice system. And of course, if the disciplinary action leads to a child being arrested, whether by an SRO or a referral from the school itself, it will affect the way that the child interacts with school. And so I really want to get to questions here, but I just wrote down some, I guess, thought questions that we should be considering not only for schools, but for the juvenile justice system. And I always challenge students in my class on the first day of class to remember who they were when they were teenagers. We often like to think that we were perfect human beings, but very often when people think about it, it's like, yeah, I was doing a lot of stuff that was risky. I was doing a lot of stuff for which I could have gotten in trouble, but I didn't get caught, or I got caught, but the response was not a disciplinary response. It was more of a counseling response. And so I think that all of us need to ask ourselves, if we were to begin the educational system from scratch, what would it look like? What would discipline look like? We very often think that kids today are so much worse than they were when we were kids. And it doesn't matter how old you are. I'm convinced that Adam said to Eve, these kids today are so bad. But I grew up in Washington, D.C. I was in D.C. public schools from grades K through 8. There were school fights. There were all kinds of bad behaviors in school. I remember once one of my classmates threatening to throw one of my teachers out the window if she didn't shut up. But never did anyone ever get arrested in school, because that was not seen as an appropriate reaction. So the question that I ask my students in juvenile justice, and I would expand this thought to the educational system, is this: how would these systems look if we were preparing every child to go to Princeton? And if we're not doing that, why aren't we doing that? I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleague.
So, Ms. Hall, let's talk about how it works. What happens at the school level that actually leads to the involvement in the juvenile justice system? We've talked about SROs, and we jumped the gun there a bit when we talked about, we didn't really define school resource officer, which we need to do. But law enforcement comes to schools in many ways. It might be a school resource officer who is placed in the school, but it also might be school systems calling the police to the site. It also might be a teacher charging a child. So can you take us through that process?
Sure. And Jason, you can put up the slide that I sent along. And thank you all again for having me. So this slide here is a pretty confusing flow chart. I'm sure it looks very confusing to you on your Zoom screen. And I chose this intentionally because this is from the Department of Juvenile Services Data Resource Guide. And this is their manual that shows how Maryland's juvenile legal system works. And I'm going to use juvenile legal system because I think there's very little that's just in the way that the system currently exists. And so this is what they say children are going to go through. Now, as you can see, this is a really confusing and convoluted process. There's a lot of on-ramps and off-ramps. And so just as Professor Neal was saying, putting yourself in the position of where you were when you were a teenager and making decisions, whether they were good or bad, imagine you are 13, 14, 15, and you're right at that black dot right at the beginning, which is the incident that happens that gets you involved in the juvenile legal system. And you're trying to understand all of these potential next steps that can happen in this very complicated flow chart. That's what we are asking children to be able to do and comprehend when we pull them into the juvenile legal system. So usually what will happen, especially when we're talking about a school-based incident, is something will happen at school. So there will be a fight between two students and one student will lose. And sometimes a school police officer will charge the student that won the fight. The parent whose child lost the fight, maybe they'll file a citizen's complaint. That is something that you're allowed to do here, file a citizen's complaint on someone else's child. Maybe the school refers that. Something else which Monisha alluded to is maybe you're a student that has a disability, a learning disability, and you're engaging in behavior that is part of that disability. You can still be charged for that type of conduct. So maybe you throw something at a teacher. I've had clients, just as Monisha, who are homeless, who are trespassing, quote unquote, after hours, and they are found by a principal who was there after hours and sends that case to the Department of Juvenile Services. I also want to highlight, I'm sure that many of you saw the video that was circulating in the last few weeks of the 5-year-old who two police officers in Montgomery County came and accosted and berated and really terrorized, all for walking out of school. Now that child was 5 years old, and if you watched the whole video, you'll learn that there was something that happened in the classroom that precipitated this entire walking out. I want to make it very clear that under Maryland juvenile law, that 5-year-old, there's nothing stopping that 5-year-old from being charged in juvenile court for that behavior. We have no minimum age in Maryland. Legislation to establish a minimum age did not pass this past session. And so we are subjecting kids that are babies all the way up through 17 and 18 years old to this incredibly complicated process. But what usually happens is after whatever incident happens, the police make a decision. If the police are called, they either decide to arrest that child, take them to a juvenile jail, or to fill out what's called a J1, which is like an arrest document. A lot of people, one big misconception is that if you have a J1, that isn't a real arrest. And one thing that's important to know is that is always going to be on that child's juvenile record. Anytime that there's any type of contact, that's ending up on a kid's juvenile record. And so let's say you have a bunch of these silly, you're disrespecting, quote unquote, the teacher, and a bunch of J1s are filled out, but they never go anywhere because the Department of Juvenile Services says, well, this isn't a big deal. But later down the road, you pick up a juvenile case that is a big deal. All of a sudden, all of those prior contacts are part of your juvenile record. And so anytime that a J1 is filled out, that is incredibly harmful to a child because that is part of their juvenile record, just as if they were an adult. But if a J1 is filled out, it's kind of like a summons. And so that goes to the Department of Juvenile Services, and they make a decision that's kind of on the bottom half of this flow chart of whether this kid, they don't need any services at all. They don't need to be involved in the juvenile system at all. Maybe we can refer that child to some services and close out the case because we recognize this kid needs additional support, but we don't really want to bring them into court. Or the Department of Juvenile Services can say, we want this case to go into court just like any other case, and they can send that along to the state's attorney's office. And so when that case goes to the state's attorney's office, they make a decision of whether to charge that case or not and bring that case to juvenile court. Now, when a child is arrested, they're taken to a juvenile jail and they appear before a judge the next day. And that judge makes a decision of whether that child will remain in a juvenile jail until their trial date, whether they will be released on some type of ankle monitor or other conditions, or whether they will just be released. And then from there, once you get to court, it is just like an adult process. So you have a trial that looks just like an adult trial where witnesses are called, you have an attorney. And so this is what I do as a juvenile defense attorney, representing young people, crossing witnesses on behalf of my clients, and making arguments as to why my client is innocent or guilty. Well, I'm not arguing that they're guilty, but innocent of the types of conduct that took place in school. So at the end of the trial, and this is where you get to the bottom right-hand corner, this big yellow box. So obviously I always want to win, but if you lose, on the off chance that you do lose, your client is found involved. And then the question is, what types of services do they need? So the court can say, even though I found this kid guilty, I don't think that they need any additional services because this isn't that big of a deal of a case. Or the court could say, we want to put you on probation where you have to follow certain conditions. So some of those conditions are follow the rules of home and school, have some type of drug counseling, have some type of therapy, complete community service, those types of conditions. Or the court can say, we think that you need something much more intensive and we're going to remove you from your home and place you in a juvenile facility. Now, and so you can take this down. Thank you, Jason. So I think that one of the things that is important to keep in mind is that I think oftentimes we believe that when kids are coming to the juvenile system for something that happened in school, that it's not a big deal, and that we're really trying to meet the best interests of the child and provide them supports. But once a child is involved in the juvenile legal system, it is really difficult for them to get out because there are a lot of things that they have to do, things that they have to complete that can be difficult by the nature of them being kids. So for example, I had a client really early in my time at the public defender's office who was in juvenile court for what we call a robbery, or what the court calls a robbery, which is really just taking another kid's lunch money, taking another kid's phone. That is what can constitute a robbery in juvenile court. By the time I inherited his case from a former colleague, he had been on probation for almost 2 years for something that he had already been removed from school. He was suspended from school for over a month for that, before that case even came to juvenile court. He came to juvenile court. He was put on this probation. He was put on an ankle monitor. And then because he struggled to comply with the ankle monitor, and by comply, I mean to keep the GPS charged, he was in a difficult relationship with his father. So his father was putting him out of the house, and that meant that he was violating his curfew. All of a sudden, he was being detained. And he was detained for long stretches of time over Thanksgiving and Christmas, all for something that had stemmed from a school like fight and a typical school bullying that had already been handled at the school level by the time it came to juvenile court. And this really ruptured his ability to continue in school. It damaged his relationship with his family, and ultimately did not really resolve any of the problems that I believe that the juvenile court believes that it's trying to solve. And, you know, I definitely want to get to questions as well. I could talk about this forever, but I think that it's so important to keep in mind that, you know, I think we believe because we're trying to do the best thing for kids, that this is what we need to do. And we aren't thinking so much about the consequences, but the consequences look really similar to what happens when you're in adult court. It just is that less people have access to those records, but for the times that it counts, like if you're trying to get a driver's license, maybe your juvenile record comes up when you're applying to jobs in colleges, sometimes it can come up. It really can have, in addition to, I think, the ruptures in relationships with people at school, it really can damage and harm your life in long-term ways that we don't have adequate solutions for at this time. So I think we can keep it moving, but I would encourage you all to look at the PDFs that will be included that show the flow of juvenile court and really how complicated it can be to understand that when you are just a child.
And we have 2 questions in that I'll get to with Hadassah, but I just want to also mention that I do know that the OPD has also done advocacy work around access to educational services of kids who are in detention, who are in placement, and the quality of those services and the quality of the special education services. Is that a continued concern from your perspective, Ms. Hall?
Yeah, that's definitely, and thank you for flagging that. That definitely is a major concern. When children are coming in and out of being in secure confinement in the community, one big rupture that we see is that there's a real gap in their education, because the school system that exists in the juvenile detention facilities is not analogous to their community school. So for example, a lot of my clients who were in long-term detention situations, even though they were in school that entire time when they were in the community and when they were in detention, those credits they were in school for 4 years and those credits have never accumulated to a degree because there is a mismatch between what happens in detention and what happens in the community. There are oftentimes IEPs, special education plans are not transferred between those 2 places. And so what we see is that these 2 systems, these 2 state-run systems are not working together in order to make sure that regardless of what is happening, these children still have an access to education that is fair and equitable. And instead, there's this real gap that, again, I think engenders a frustration with education, has many children who otherwise could be engaged or would be engaged becoming incredibly disheartened because you're doing all of this work and oftentimes it's not amounting to anything only because these 2 state systems are not working together and talking to each other.
Thank you for that. So there are some significant collateral impacts of being in the juvenile legal system that we need to be aware of. Hadassah, I think there are 2 questions that we can get to. I know there's a lot still we want to talk about in terms of the advocacy work that's happening in Maryland, but let's see what we can do with these questions.
Sure. The first question is for all school psychologists. There is someone who is looking for resources, information, and thoughts on how school psychologists can be part of the solution.
So I think this question really does kind of segue into some of the alternatives, right? What are the alternatives to not only school discipline, whether it's in school, out of school, suspension, but also school-based arrests, referrals to the juvenile legal system? Who wants to start on that one?
I'm happy to speak to that a little bit. And I'm really glad you raised it because it's just a reality that for many of us, suspension and even school policing and arrest are the only responses to behavior challenges that we're familiar with or have been exposed to in school. But we actually know from extensive study that those approaches do not improve student behavior. They do not address the root causes of why a student may be acting a particular way, and they do not resolve conflict. And the solutions suggested by the question really are far more effective. So maybe we can speak about just a few of those. And let me just preview. I'm not a school psychologist myself. There's many folks who have more expertise than I do, but I do want to put out there sort of just again a snapshot of some of the other approaches that have been shown to be effective in this regard. So first, and again, I think this may be referenced in the question, there's the idea of trauma-sensitive approaches, trauma-sensitive schools. And the principle there is really just that some kids hurt others because they themselves are hurting, right? So they've suffered trauma, the loss of a loved one, homelessness, addiction of a parent. We can think about in the time of COVID and ongoing protests and killing of Black people in America, that this is very much an experience that our students in Baltimore and throughout Maryland are confronting. And a trauma-sensitive school is equipped to identify that trauma among students and respond using mental health services, really comprehensive staff training, community partnerships with mental health providers, healthcare providers, food supports, housing. And what we've seen, again, from the studies that have looked at trauma-sensitive schools is that the staff report that the transformation really makes their schools feel calmer, feel safer, reduce conflict, reduce crisis, and improve student behavior. Other examples, restorative approaches or restorative justice. So this is really involves a sort of wholesale culture shift in a school where we're intentionally developing positive relationships among students and staff from the get-go, so that they're in the building not just to learn, but to truly foster, care for one another. And that makes it less likely that students will harm other students, students will harm staff, staff will harm students. And it also makes it easier to impose accountability and repair harm when it does occur, because you can't, prevent every conflict. The National Education Policy Center has reviewed the research on restorative approaches and has concluded that it convincingly demonstrates that when faithfully implemented, the strategy really does work. Kids behave better, school push-out decreases. We actually have a great example from here in Baltimore. We saw a 44% decline in suspensions in Baltimore City schools that comprehensively adopted and implemented restorative approaches.
So, Monisha, let me ask Ms. Cherayil, sorry, I know you all by your first names. Let's talk a little bit, because we're running quickly out of time. You talk about Baltimore City. Can we talk about what's been happening at the local level? There was legislation this legislative session that did not pass, but there are some things that I understand are happening at the county level. Is there anything that folks would like to talk about or update the audience on those efforts?
Sure. I don't know if any of my fellow panelists want to take that one, since I've just been speaking, or I can get us started and others can jump in.
Go for it.
Okay. So as Dean Fieo mentioned, all of us here know each other because we actually work quite a bit together. It's a small world of education advocates and folks really working in community to try to address this challenge of school pushout in Maryland. And there's many more. There's parents and students and educators who have been, in many cases, really leading this movement. Most recently, around the push for police-free schools. It's been a campaign and an effort and a concern for a long time. It gained new momentum and energy, I think, this summer with the protests that happened here in Maryland and across the country. But as you mentioned, there was legislation this session aimed at getting police out of Maryland schools and shifting state funding that currently supports school policing and redirecting it towards student mental health, towards restorative justice, towards trauma-informed teaching, all those strategies that really do work much better. That legislation didn't pass. That's not uncommon. The first year it's introduced. We still, I think, had some tremendous success in terms of educating lawmakers and the public, changing some of these perceptions that, police presence in schools is necessary to keep them safe, showing how it actually makes schools less safe for a lot of kids. And even as the legislative session is over, there's lots of ongoing local efforts. So Prince George's County, Howard County, Montgomery County, all have sort of growing local campaigns where there's been pressure on local county councils or school boards or both to get police out of schools and reinvest those resources. And there's also sort of blossoming efforts here in Baltimore City and elsewhere in the state. But those are sort of the three that are furthest along. Let me pause there since others might want to weigh in on this.
Does anyone want to say anything more about that before we turn to some questions? Okay. Hadassah, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, yeah,
Sure.
I did want to say something. I think that people who think that this is an important issue need to find an organization to team with in order to change legislation, and perhaps even more importantly, to begin the process of changing people's ideas about this. I mean, the reason that we have these SROs and the reasons that expulsion and suspensions are used is because people think that they work. And we've got to change that belief about whether or not it works. In the same way, for instance, that we're rethinking what policing should be in this country right now, we need to rethink what student discipline should be right now. And excuse me, while it's all well and good to click on something on Facebook or something like that, it actually makes a tremendous impact when you team with other people, when you help educate other people, and you're willing to write letters to your legislators and go to testify before the legislature, which
Absolutely.
is much easier now.
Absolutely. Hadassah, we have quite a few questions in the chat and not a lot of time. So do you want to pick out one or two we can address?
Absolutely. We have someone in the audience who has said that they have heard that the number of juvenile arrests and delinquency filings have gone down significantly over the last few years in Baltimore City. Specifically, that the filings of delinquency petitions have gone down 20% in 2020 from 2019. Is this evidence that the system is making the appropriate reforms?
Well, I'll say that the reason that in general, juvenile delinquency petitions have been trending downwards like steadily over time. So that's something that has remained true really since we had this whole super predator, tough on crime era where we were criminalizing so much that kids were doing. And since the early 2000s and the 2010s, there has been a steady decline. However, where we have seen the biggest change and the biggest drop has been because of COVID and schools being closed. And I think that has spoken tremendously to the amount of cases that were coming in that were cases that had no business being in juvenile court in the first place. So really the drop off is coming from kids having less contact with police, being in their schools and not being sent to juvenile court for the types of cases that I was describing before, taking another kid's phone, having a school fight, those types of things were not coming into court. So that's been where the real drop off is. And I think part of that is obviously a function of schools being closed. And when kids are coming back to school, kids are going to be interacting again. But also we can see that they're clearly, I think that exemplifies that the problem and the bloatedness that we are experiencing in the juvenile legal system is really because of us overcriminalizing these other behaviors, because my clients who are already in the system for those types of behaviors, their cases have been able to be closed successfully in this period of time because they haven't been going to school and still being targeted by the same officers who had problems with them before. They weren't going to school and being put out of the classroom because of behaviors that were part of their disability, right? So that is the type of thing we need to be looking at. And I think the Department of Juvenile Services did a lot during COVID to make sure that they were still meeting the needs of clients in order that did need services and did need the support of that particular system in order to make sure that they were still getting those services met. And so for all of the terrible things that have come from COVID, I do think that it caused a large system interruption to think and rethink what we're doing with this current system as it exists. Most of the juvenile prisons that are out in Western Maryland have much lower, if any, children there. We closed at least 2 juvenile prisons during COVID. And I think that really speaks to the fact that we had far too many children in juvenile prisons and jails that didn't need to be there in the first place.
Well, that is really good news to hear. I know that we're at the 6 o'clock hour and we need to wrap up. We have lots of questions in the chat, which I'll try and address offline to folks, and really appreciate everyone's participation. How about just one final thought from each of our panelists? Are you hopeful? Are you discouraged? Is there reason to think that things are going to change? We've been working on this issue for a long time. Monisha, let's start with you. I know you need to be somewhere at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, thanks so much. I am hopeful. With respect to the campaigns around police-free schools, as I mentioned, there's just been a tremendous growth and sort of momentum built by students, by parents, by educators who are dealing with cops in their schools every single day, and are finally, and have been raising alarms for a long time. And it seems like people are hearing it maybe for the first time. And I'd say that, there were a few questions about sort of how can folks get involved. And that's exciting too. And there's a lot of opportunities. I would say start, close to home. As I think Professor Neal said, we're confronting a mass of misinformation and misperception about the role of police in schools. So start by having conversations with yourself and your friends and your family about, how you experienced, your behavior and challenges and social emotional growth in school, and how your kids do, and whether your kids ever did anything that could be a crime, which is, if they were you or your kids ever disruptive in school? Did you ever take someone else's backpack? Did you ever go into school after hours? Think about how you would want your child to be treated if that happened, and have that conversation with folks who may assume that that the role of school police or the role of exclusionary discipline is just a force for good, and educate yourself about how the research, 40 years of research that tells us that school police do not stop shootings, do not reduce school-based violence, only funnel kids into the school to prison pipeline for minor behaviors for the most part. And then we'll be sure to share resources about ways to potentially get involved with local campaigns, ways to get help for students, clients, folks in your life that may be facing exclusionary discipline and need legal advice. So thank you so much, Dean Fieo, for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. How about Ms. Hall? What are your final thoughts?
Well, in terms of if I'm hopeful, I oscillate every day. I think the news this week and every week, quite frankly, has been overwhelming and really emotional. And I think that I'm hopeful to the extent that we start recognizing the humanity of Black children and we start taking seriously that Black children are children who do things that all types of kids do and have always done. And so to the extent that we continue moving towards that and towards recognizing the humanity of Black children, I am hopeful for change. But every time that I look at the statistics and I look at the data, what's clear is that the schools that have the most police in them are schools that have Black and brown children. And if this was happening in majority white communities, if this was happening in majority affluent communities, I do not think that we would be sitting with the same comfort that we have when we are policing Black and brown kids in poor communities. And so I hope that we continue to move in the direction of recognizing that Black children are human and they deserve grace and the opportunity to make mistakes and to grow and change. When I think about myself as a teenager, I did a lot of things that could have ended me up in so many different places than where I am today. It was because people gave me that grace that I am sitting here. And that's what all of my clients and all children deserve.
Absolutely. Understanding. That's what they need. Ms. McClellan, do you think that there's an opportunity next legislative session to maybe pass legislation that will curb what the expansion that we've seen since in Maryland since 2018, if not before?
That's definitely another area where I think we can be hopeful, but it's going to take a lot of work. So just to briefly highlight House Bill 1089, colloquial.
Can you, we can't hear. Can others hear?
Hear me better now?
No.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. Little switch of the microphone, learning all these Zoom tricks as we're constantly in Zoom land. So apologies for that. What I was starting to say is that I think I agree with what everyone has said about the change that the police-free schools movement that is led by students is bringing. I think in Maryland, we're watching House Bill 1089, which is also known as the Police-Free Schools Act, kind of colloquially. So we're watching that bill and hopeful that the legislature will act to prohibit schools from contracting with law enforcement agencies. So that's one to follow. And then also House Bill 496, which has been called colloquially the Counselors Not Cops Act, if passed, would move Maryland school districts in the direction of police-free schools by investing in school professionals. So we're watching both of those and are hopeful around that. And just to also highlight at the federal level, there has also been legislation that has been introduced and hasn't gone anywhere, and we're hopeful that it will be reintroduced under the Counseling, Not Criminalization in Schools Act. So all of that is potential for change, but it's going to take real organizing and pressure to keep the momentum up.
Absolutely. And Professor Neal, do you want to have the last word here?
Sure. I'll just tell one quick story, and I don't know if it represents cynicism or hopefulness, but when I have a nephew, my oldest nephew and I went to the Great Blacks and Wax Museum when he was about 7 or 8 years old. And there was a display that showed a file cabinet with chains around it and papers coming out of it and arms and legs coming out of it. And he asked me what that was about. And I'm thinking school to prison pipeline. I know he won't understand that. And so what I said to him is, there are some places that look at a boy that does a bad thing and says that is a bad boy. There are other places that look at a boy that does a bad thing and say, that's a good boy that did a bad thing. And it's disheartening to me that we could have the same conversation today, even though my nephew is now 34 years old. And so my hopefulness is always present because I sort of don't have a choice. But I also know that the issues that we're talking today are not just limited to the school system, are not just limited to the juvenile justice system, but really go to the issue of whether or not we're willing to treat one another with dignity and respect. And until we can say that we as a society are willing to treat every single person, whether they did a bad thing or not, with dignity and respect, I feel that these issues are going to just go on and on and on and on.
Absolutely. We've been working on them for a long time. And in closing, I just want to thank you all for the hard work that you're doing, the advocacy work, the education work, the individual representation that impacts the lives of not only the children, but their families, their loved ones. It means everything to a family when they have that representation, and change can happen for that child. So I want to thank you for participating as panelists. I want to thank our audience for being here tonight, and I hope that everyone stays safe. And please join us for future webinars. You can find the information on our website. Thank you so much.